To all three of you. You guys are helping every day to keep our country safe, and no one's infallible, and nor is our system, as we've seen, because there have been gaps and there have been problems. But we want to thank you for your service today. I'm particularly concerned about two things. One is the homegrown terrorist threat. We've talked about that before in this committee and in our subcommittee, and I continue to believe that our online presence is not what it ought to be, particularly the counter-narrative. I understand these groups are moving from some of the services like Twitter, which is good, but they're going to encrypted sites, as Director Comey said, and we still are not figuring out who has responsibility for that. And I want to get into another topic, so I want to ask you to respond to that, but I may ask you some questions, more detailed questions in writing regarding who's in charge and how are we going to get the best minds working on the counter-narrative to what we're seeing online even today and continues to attract some of our young people. The second one is just the intelligence issue, and both you, Director Comey, and Director Rasmussen talked about it again today. You, before this committee, told us a few months ago you were concerned about this issue. And when you're talking about foreign fighters and other jihadists scattering in 2 to 5 years, as you said this morning, being one of your major concerns, you've also told us we have gaps in intelligence there, particularly in what you call the crucial zones of conflict. And so to me, this is a critical issue, and it was just raised by one of my colleagues. But how do you get that intelligence so that when people are scattering, Director Rasmussen, you talked about the need for biometrics because of people being able to change their identity, as we've seen in the European situation. So those are the two concerns I think that are most pressing for me. But if I could raise another issue, since it's a 9/11 hearing, there is legislation that we've worked on, thanks to Secretary Johnson bringing it to us. FEMA wants us very much to codify and help protect some of our urban search and rescue volunteers. FEMA task forces around the country and rely on firefighters and other experts to come together and form these task forces. We're really proud of our task forces in Ohio. And so we wrote legislation, which was reported out of this committee unanimously on May 25th with the support of FEMA and the administration. Ranking Member Carper is a co-sponsor, Senator Booker is a co-sponsor. They both agreed to try to help to get this thing done. We've now had it on the floor for a while with no success getting what's called a hotline done, meaning just getting everyone to approve it since it is non-controversial. So I'm just announcing today that I plan to go on the floor and offer it under unanimous consent because we cannot figure out who's blocking it. We can't imagine someone would want to block this. On 9/11, I was here. My wife was visiting, a rare visit to Washington, actually, and 9/11 hit. She got what I think is the last rental car out of Enterprise out of Washington and drove straight home to be with our kids. And as she was driving on some lonely highway in Pennsylvania, Ohio Task Force 1 was coming the other way, and lights were flashing, and she recognized them, and they were driving into danger. And I've known a lot of the men and women involved with that task force, including men who went that day on that trip who did go into harm's way. They deserve this protection. This protects their job when they get back. It protects them from liability. It protects them in terms of their insurance. It's just common sense stuff. So, one, I want to thank the International Association of Firefighters. I want to thank FEMA and others who have endorsed this and supported this and helped us to move it. But let's get this done. We cannot wait till another Congress. FEMA actually came originally to this Congress about 10 years ago on this issue and said we wanted to codify it. So, Secretary Johnson, thanks for your support of it. I hope that we can move it forward. Do you have any comments on that, Secretary Johnson, this morning?
Senator, I'm familiar with the legislation. I know FEMA is very supportive of it, and I hope it passes.
Thank you. With regard to the other two topics on homegrown terrorism and the online challenge, can we dig a little deeper as to who's responsible in our government to provide that counter-narrative? It's not necessarily something that government does well, but we in this committee have been able to look at some of the videos that these jihadists and murderers are putting out there showing terrorists providing candy to children, being in playgrounds, that it's somehow a euphoric life. And then we've seen some of the counter-narrative, and some of it has not been very effective, to be frank. And I don't know who is best to respond to that. I know you've been involved with this, Secretary Johnson, but who is responsible within our government, and how can we ensure that we can get the best minds, including from the private sector involved in this, to have a more effective counter-narrative out there to stop some of this homegrown terrorism, which, if you look at these cases, whether it's Orlando or San Bernardino or Cincinnati, Ohio, where we had a young man arrested, so much of it is being encouraged by online messaging by ISIS and other groups?
Well, first, the counter message, given the nature of it, would not be very credible if it were a government message. This is something that has to be developed within the community. To the extent that we in government have a role in promoting that and facilitating the partnerships, getting the right people together in the room to develop this counter message, we have in my department the Office of Community Partnerships, which at the moment is leading an interagency task force that consists of FBI, NCTC, and others, where we draw from all of our agencies the best talent and the best minds. This task force was put together probably about a year ago. I think it's a good thing. No one department has a corner on this, but there is, in fact, a task force led by my department devoted to countering violent extremism, building community partnerships, which includes this effort to amplify the counter message.
Have you seen their work?
I have. I've seen the work of that's out there online. I think it needs a broader message. We're also, by the way, encouraging this through grants, through State Department grants. In the future, I want to see more of my department do the same thing. We're encouraging young people to develop these kinds of materials, and we're encouraging innovation in this area. But inherently, it's not a government message.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying about the government message not being as effective. I also, though, believe that we cannot just allow it to not be a counter message out there because the government does not organize it. In other words, if the private sector is not doing it, if you can't get, as you say, young people to go online voluntarily with their own counter message that's effective, I think it's incredibly important. And so we'll follow up again with more specific questions, but I think the task force, as I understand it, some of the task force efforts have not been very compelling from a sort of production point of view, you know, to make it so that it is something that can help to change minds and persuade young people. So we'll continue to follow up on that. Thank you.
Senator Sass.